Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this really vital discussion tonight. World of War Crimes with Geoffrey Robertson KC. A more timely discussion we couldn't be having at the moment, whether we're looking at Iran, in Gaza, South Africa. The globe is in an awful place, and the collapse of the international order, I suspect, plays a role in that. It is absolutely wonderful, Geoffrey, to have you with us tonight. Your morning, our night. Welcome.
Thank you, Julie.
Oh, you need no introduction, but I will give you an introduction nevertheless.
Oh,
Geoffrey Robinson is an Australian and British barrister, academic, author, and broadcaster, founder and former joint head of Doherty Street Chambers. Geoffrey has served as a United Nations appeal judge and as the first president of its War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone, is an author of, it's fair to say, numerous books that include The Justice Game, The Tyrannicide Brief, Crimes Against Humanity, The Case of the Pope, An Inconvenient Genocide, and many more. But tonight we are discussing, oh, that looks all wrong, doesn't it? World of War Crimes, Eyeless in Gaza and Beyond. Geoffrey, thank you so much for making the time tonight.
it's a great pleasure.
We're meeting tonight. The bombing in Iran is still going on. The US may be bombing fishermen off the coast of Venezuela. There might be war crimes being committed in Gaza, DRC, around the globe. Your book starts with the opening line, which doesn't bode well for any of us. And it says, the rules-based world order set in motion at San Francisco in 1945 is no longer viable. We've only got an hour, and I know a lot of people want to ask a lot of questions, but can we start with that statement? Why is it not viable anymore?
Well, it was set up in 1945 and 1946 with the very important participation of Australia with Dr. Evatt, who was one of the founders of this world order, which was based on the United Nations and on, in particular, the Security Council. The United Nations Charter begins with a preamble saying, in effect, the purpose of this organization is to prevent the scourge of war. And the very first article, second article, commits the nations of the world to stopping aggression. Aggression being the invasion of other countries, of member countries of the UN, and all the power of the United Nations is given to the Security Council. Now, as time has evolved, the Security Council has become worthless. It is America, Russia, China, Britain and France, the five permanent members of the Security Council, who are given a veto over any action by the UN. And that, in recent years, has become disastrous. The Security Council has become poleaxed, in effect, because any resolution about stopping the war in Ukraine gets vetoed by Russia. Any resolution about stopping the war in Gaza gets vetoed by America on behalf of Israel. And any resolution, if China were to invade Taiwan, which is fairly possible, will be vetoed by China. So there is the problem, that the initial problem is that the Security Council, designed as the engine of the United Nations, has stopped working. So we don't.
Did it ever actually work? Like, was there ever a time where this, like now we look at it and it's absolutely obvious that that can't work. But was
Mm.
there ever a time when it did work?
Yes, in the early days, it certainly did. And China was added in 1970 as a permanent member, and that complicated things a bit. But theoretic, as it seemed in 1946, after the Nuremberg trials, and there was even a proposal that Dr. Everett and the Americans produced of keeping atom bombs, which were just being developed, in the possession of the United Nations. It was a time of hope and some cooperation. But of course, over the years, it was the Cold War that kept hostilities deep frozen. And on recent years, despite the seeming collapse of aggressive communism in the Gorbachev days,
Mm.
we are now in an era where there is no collaboration towards peace, the commitment to peace, which was the fundamental thing about the United Nations, has been lost in the uh, dis in the poleaxing of the Security Council, and the Security Council can't do its job, and that means the United Nations can't work. I mean, if Russia were to bomb Kiev tomorrow using nuclear weapons, Russia could not be expelled from the United Nations because it would require a resolution of the Security Council, which Russia would veto.
Veto. But
So
that actually
that
illuminates the other problem. And I guess what really struck me reading the book is, I guess we were brought up to believe that this was a very strong, very robust, very principled structure of the international rules-based order. And then I read your book and I'm reading about the question of nuclear war. Um, why is that not a war crime? Why is it not a war crime to end life on this planet? And perhaps you'd like to explain to us why actually doing that is not a war
well,
crime.
because, and this is one of the purposes of my book, to explain what people don't perhaps realize at first. They think, oh, war crimes, that means bombing hospitals, killing civilians. Well, it doesn't, because the definition of war crimes has been left to the major powers, who are warmongers. We're leaving it to Russia, America, to diplomats who are in hock to the warmongers. And for that reason, war crimes have been carefully defined so as not to trip up any of the major powers in the wars of their choice. And I can perhaps most simply explain it by what happened at Nuremberg. Because in Nuremberg, we had in the dock, as played by Russell Crowe in a recent film, Hermann Goering. Goering was responsible for the killing of a lot of civilians, mainly women and children, in the Blitz. The Blitz was the attack by over 9 months by German bombers on the poor suburbs of London. And you know how many people were killed? 43,000. Only 43,000, you're tempted to say, because of course in Gaza we have
Yeah.
over 70,000 dead already. And in the Blitz, of course, Goering should have been charged with the war crime of killing civilians. It was blatant, it was obvious, he was guilty. But the Allies, who were putting Nuremberg together, didn't want that because they feared Goering would run a defense, which is called, in Latin, of course, the tu quoque defense. The defense that, yes, I did it, but you did it too. And boy, did we ever. In London, in a suburb of London in 1943, the Allies constructed typical German residential homes and typical Japanese residential homes. And they experimented to work out the bomb that would spread fire most easily. And they did attack Tokyo, for example. 100,000 people, civilians, were burnt alive in German cities, beginning with Hamburg, of course, with all the major cities were bombed. 600,000 people were killed, most clearly in Dresden, perhaps, but there were many more. So the Allies were hypocritical in the extreme if they prosecuted Goering, and they were terrified that he would run the defense, that you did it too, which we did. And so he wasn't prosecuted for the Blitz. There was no precedent developed from Nuremberg about bombing and killing civilians. And so we have a world in which, in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Congo, in many parts of Africa, we see television pictures of children being dug out of the rubble of residential areas having been bombed and destroyed. So there is no effective war crimes law against the killing of civilians by drones and aeroplane bombs and so forth. And so that is it. We all think, oh, we've got a war crimes law which stops countries, aggressor countries, bombing hospitals or schools or museums. We think these are places that are protected, and they should be, by war crimes law. But the trick is in the definition, because in the definition, under the latest being the International Criminal Court Article 8 definition of war crimes, there is a defense of military advantage. If you can argue that the military advantage is greater than the killing of lots of civilians, you get away with it. And so Israel is arguing, for example, in Gaza, that they can attack a refugee camp and kill 50 refugees in order to kill one Hamas terrorist. Well, that's not that's disproportional, I would have thought, as a war crimes judge, that you're entitled to kill 50 innocent people in order to get at one Hamas fighter. But this is how Israel argues it and justifies its attacks on refugee camps. So these problems stem from the fact that war crimes law is written by, if not war criminals, certainly warmongers, to keep their troops safe. And the problem has escalated recently with the Trump administration's contempt for war law. The most we can see it in the bombing of the boats from from South America that are being bombed, even when bombed and the sailors are clinging to the wreckage, there's a second bombing that kills them, and that is, par excellence, a war crime set out in a case in 1917 when the German submarine bombed a Canadian hospital boat and then machine gunned the survivors, and that was then set down as a classic war crime. Every naval officer is taught it, but that doesn't appeal to the Americans, which have virtually abolished war law. And so the most recent edict from Pete Hegseth is that the ancient law against what is called giving quarter, if a man surrenders and is taken as a prisoner of war, he must be treated humanely. And that's been the law since, well, for hundreds of years. You don't kill your prisoners. And Hegseth says we're going to abolish that or ignore that law. And that is quite frightening.
The whole landscape that you describe in the book, and as I said, we don't have much time, but you start, what was it in 1138 when was it the Catholic Church decided that
Well, I said that the first war crime, international war crime, was the decree of the Lateran Council of the Catholic Church, which
yeah,
banned the use of the crossbow, which shot arrows extremely quickly into human beings, but it was banned in wars between Christians.
only.
Not only Christians, yes. Muslims could be skewered by crossbow arrows, but
Yeah.
not Christians or crusaders.
And truly, as the twig is bent, so the tree will grow. I mean, from that point onwards, it looks like there has been a distortion of humanity. But as I said, the world you describe so beautifully is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. We've got really international law lying face down in the pool. We've got a rise of, like I keep trying to find a better word for it, but the only word that comes to mind are warlords, basically, in
That's
Russia,
right.
in America, in across Africa. That's what we're seeing. All of us, I guess I'm wondering what happens when the majority of humankind let go of this idea that there is such a thing as the international rules-based order, because it is something that we use to keep us feeling safe at night. That if push comes to shove, someone somewhere, there is a police force somewhere that will intervene and stop the bad people doing bad things. I mean, I think it's as primitive as that. And I wonder what happens when we all slowly come to grips with the fact that there is no one anywhere who will stop the bad people from doing bad things. It seems we've got two choices from that reality. We can either militarize ourselves to the back teeth and go, well, if that's the case, we're going to tool ourselves up so no one even thinks about it in our neighborhood. Or we can do what? And Geoffrey, I
Well,
think you have
yeah.
ideas about this.
I think there is an alternative. We can't. The United Nations is obviously important on issues like climate change and refugees and what have you. It's important to have a forum where countries with common interests can meet and decide what to do. But it doesn't work with war, which is its essential purpose. And so we have to look to, if we cannot obtain a working agreement between countries like America, but Russia, and the rest, then we have to look to some other standard, and maybe that standard is democracy. Maybe what we need to do is to have a body which represents the democratic nations of the world, because democracy is never mentioned in the United Nations Charter. The United Nations does not stand for democracy. Democracy is unprotected. It is unprotected in international law. There's nothing other than a rather obscure case in Fiji that was done by an international court, and that said that if you've got a democracy, you can't get rid of it unless your military junta or whatever can prove that it's got public support. And that it did well, it didn't. And so one of the Fijian governments was ruled illegal. But that's the only precedent in international law that gives any protection to democracy. So it may be that the future depends on the democracies of the world forming their own international organization with a commitment to human rights that is binding. Now, you say, what? Who are they? These countries? Well, actually, there is the European Union and the states of Europe, some 40 of them, now including Hungary, now that the government has changed, and they are utterly committed to democracy and have, of course, very considerable power, soft power and hard power through NATO, subject to American continuing membership of NATO, which is not clear. But even without America, the 40 or so countries of Europe, plus Britain, would be a very powerful group to begin with. Where else? Actually, there is a body called the Commonwealth of Nations, which once in the 1960s, under Sonny Ramphal, was potent and did much to destroy apartheid, but of course, more recently has been pretty useless, particularly when Prince Charles was, as he then was made its head. And that has meant that it's completely useless. But it's got 56 countries, including such important ones as Malaysia and India and Australasia. It could, if married, so to speak, with Europe, that would give 100 countries, plus some of the important countries of South America, Brazil, most notably, under my old client Lula, it would be a valuable addition. So there is no doubt that there are sufficient democratic countries that if they were capable of forming an organization and a coalition could be a deterrent to the invasion of Taiwan by China. I mean, it would have enough hard and soft power, and that may be the only way to go. But whether the Commonwealth could ever get its act together, we'll see. It's meeting in Antigua at Chogam in November, but I suspect it will remain a pretty useless organization.
We're getting, I've noticed a lot of questions as soon as you start talking about a kind of council of democracy or a compact of democracy, however we describe this. The questions are coming in about straight away, how do we define democracy? Where would we locate a country like the US or Israel on that spectrum, if it's a continuum? But I guess before we go to those concrete questions, I'm wondering about there's such a kind of dangerous moment, isn't there? The moment when one system collapses and a brand new thing is beginning to emerge. It's a desperately fragile moment. I think most of the world would agree that when it comes to maintaining peace or combating violence against civilians, the UN does not work. It does a lot of stuff very well. It doesn't do that at all. So then there's the moment of going, what do you think is the appetite for this new formulation? And does it ride the wave that appears to be really rising at the moment of middle power coalitions? As China and the US, well, certainly the US squares off at China. I'm not quite sure that China's doing that, but there is an emergence of middle power powers talking to each other, going, maybe collectively we can
Mm,
deal with AI, we can deal with national security. So I'm wondering if it fits into that kind of political moment and what the appetite is that you have got. Like, obviously, you are talking about this all over the place. What
mm,
kind of appetite and what can we do in Australia?
mm.
Be my
Well,
second question.
Australia would have to be part of this. I mean, we're virtually part of NATO already, but the the talk has started as a result of Trump basically threatening to pull out of NATO, threatening to invade Greenland or Canada. And this has led Europe, certainly, to come together, Britain included, in the support for Ukraine, which now that Hungary has changed, is unanimous and has started people thinking, well, if Europe can cohere as a combination of democracies, then maybe there can be another coordinated body, that club, if you like, of democracies that can provide a deterrent to those authoritarian countries that are minded to invade their neighbors. Well, I've suggested the Commonwealth as one obvious 56 countries to add to the 40 European countries, with such vital countries as Malaysia and India. And of course, the democracies of South America. So it's not beyond possibility that there will emerge a an organization representing the democracies of the world that will have some power and some both hard power and soft power that will deter other invasions, other wars, and which can end wars, most importantly.
Yeah.
But there is the problem that you have superpowers at the moment who are interested, invested in war, America and Russia being classic examples. And so that is a future that is by no means certain, but it seems to me to be the only sensible future to unite around the possibility of democracies. How do you define it? Well, it's for those countries to define it themselves by joining the organization. And if they are acceptable and if they accept the rules, which are basically a human rights charter, and they do not go and jail or kill those who peacefully protest, for example, they don't hold political prisoners or they're subject to uh, a court that can free them. You know, that's not a problem really. The problem is getting the organization up and running.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, even if such an organization didn't have hard power, and I think the prospect of a joint military capacity to 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 defend is probably the highest hurdle. But I was just thinking as you were discussing it, wouldn't it be interesting to think about all the tools such a collective of nations could have, like the capacity to boycott, to sanction, to divest from, the capacity, AI data centers is there a kind of, in this new game of snakes and ladders, does AI actually offer a snake potentially where, you know, I don't know, say America, this had formed and America started attacking Venezuela or Cuba or Greenland or whatever. I just wonder, there is so much anxiety about AI and cyber warfare and all of that. It would be really interesting to imagine that actually those potentially destructive powers could be used to hold a kind of 800-pound gorilla like America in check in a new world. I'm just imagining the kind of powers this new order
Mm.
could potentially rely on. Um,
Yeah, I think there is a place, obviously, for soft power, for values, for human values. And I think that a body that had those written down as part of its charter. AI is something we have to come to terms with, particularly in weapons. The prospect of weapons that can think for themselves and decide who to kill is no longer science fiction, it's science.
mm,
And there is no rule against it. There is no law. War law is still back in the 1940s and has not been developed. The United Nations hasn't, the Security Council is responsible, and it hasn't borne that responsibility. So there is a lot to be done by a new organization that has real power, both soft and through NATO, at least military.
yeah. It's a disappointing comment that I'm aware that when you talk about a coalition of nations that would adhere and organize around a Bill of Human Rights or a Charter of Human Rights,
Mm,
Australia would be the only one missing in that because we don't have a Charter of Human Rights. So it would either accelerate our adoption of a Bill of Human Rights, or we would be left hanging out with the warlords, going unable to join the club because we
mm.
don't have that. And I guess the other, while we're being depressing, the other observation is, of course, that the UN arose off the bloody field of the Second World War when the entire world was exhausted and appalled with itself and
Mm.
willing to do things that were previously unimaginable.
Yeah, to end the scourge of war, as it
Yeah,
said in its
yeah.
charter. But Australia was part of that. Australians don't realize just how Dr. Everett and his team fashioned the new
Mm,
the new world order in 1945. He was truly amazing. He's seen
mm.
as a losing politician in Australian terms, but in international terms, Everett was a colossus. And so I don't, and our courts enforce international treaties, so I don't think that there is any problem with Australia taking the lead in what would be a revitalization, perhaps, of the old Commonwealth and moving, being a prime mover in any organization that was there to promote democracy.
Do you, and I promise everyone, I'm just looking at all the questions rolling in. I promise I will stop talking. I will go to the questions in a second. Um, do you see, I guess, is there a formation of this happening? Are there avenues open for this dialogue? And are you satisfied, I guess, that most people understand that the UN, because of the kind of catch-22 in the Security Council, the UN is never going to resolve questions of armed conflict and law. Are you are you satisfied that enough people are aware of that to really get momentum and energy behind, if not that, then what?
Well, people are not aware, but they can be made aware. And politicians, of course, and institutes and NGOs can understand, I think, once it's explained, that the UN cannot serve its prime purpose, which is to peace. And that we need to, if we can't get at that through the UN, which is fine with health and climate change and so forth, in trying to get agreements. But if there can be no agreement on peace, and there can't because of the divisions in the Security Council that look like being permanent, um, then it is to some other standard we must look.
Mm.
And democracy is the one standard that the UN has nothing to do with. It's not even mentioned in its charter. And so we have organizations of purported democracies. You ask, well, what does can you self-define a democracy? Well, any country that would join this organization of democracies would sign up to a Bill of Rights that would be enforceable by the organization's court. And if they developed undemocratic tendencies like locking up political prisoners and not allowing people to stand for elections, then they would be subject to, or they'd be thrown out of the organization. So that's an answer to that
Yeah.
objection.
And why would a nation want to join this organization?
Well, its people would want it to
Right,
join an organization
right,
that would protect their democracy.
right.
I mean, democracy can produce people like Trump. It can produce people like Hitler, in
Mm.
fact, who was democratically elected until he, in fact, abolished it. But that's an issue that with an organization that actually enforced human rights, democracy, uh, those countries that purported to be democracies, I always think of Lee Kuan Yew's
Yeah, well,
Singapore,
that's right.
uh,
That's right.
was would be thrown out. So there it is. If they wanted to be out, they're out, and they're um, seen as scabrous uh, kind of countries, and the governments are not traded with and are sanctioned, and
Yeah,
all of
okay.
that. So
Yeah,
that's. But those that share the values, the human rights values of an organization of democracies, would be supported, I imagine, by their
by the
population,
paper.
by the
So in
people. Yeah.
Yeah, so in a sense, you're describing something that on one level is a kind of legal, political, elite proposition in one way, but actually to fulfill that, we would need a really solid groundswell of a kind of community-wide or grassroots demand that we become
Yeah.
part of this. That's
Sure.
such a fantastic idea, Geoffrey. I think,
Well, it's an idea whose time has come simply because the UN's time has passed. The Security Council, as guarantor of the peace, is no longer a credible proposition.
yeah. And one of the many questions that's come in has underscored that by saying, um, we know actually in the UK very recently, I understand, released a long-term report on the impacts of climate change on the UK, as I understand it,
Mm.
which was pretty chilling, even though much of it was redacted. In Australia, we have released half a report on the impacts of climate change, but the government has refused to release the intelligence report on climate change. Two reasons, I understand. One, because it's terrifying, and two, because
Mm,
they've got no solution. But from what I understand, one of the scenarios that are common in all of these forward-thinking reports on climate change is that ecological collapse is going to drive conflict on steroids. Um, and someone has asked in the question and answer, is I think it goes to the question of the development of ecocide as a war crime
mm,
and
mm.
ecological collapse. And I guess, did you want to speak to that? Or would ecocide be folded into a kind of, I'm trying to think of a word for this, coalition of democracies?
Yes, I, in my book, make the case for a crime of ecocide and give potential definitions, and it should certainly be in the principles of any democratic organization, which should have war crimes laws as part of those principles, which include ecocide, as well as making it an absolute offense to bomb any hospital or school or museum and so forth. But that is something that is down the line. I think climate change is very much on Europe's mind at the moment because we've suffered a massive heat wave which has killed a couple of thousand people in one way or another. And no one doubts that climate change is beginning and is dangerous and is a threat to the planet sooner, perhaps, rather than later.
I have a question here from Matthew, who says the irony is that the earlier US administration promoted the idea of a community of democracies. He says the US is complex and will remain relevant to this debate. Could you comment, though, on the role of the ICJ, ICC, and other bodies which still boldly defend international law?
Yes, they are bold, and it's very good to see the ICJ uh, issuing judgments that are fearless and are principled, of course, so that at the moment the ICJ has delivered, for example, a very important judgment on the West Bank and Gaza, belonging to their people and having been expropriated and stolen, in effect, by Israel. And that is hundreds of pages of analysis of the true history of the area. It's now weighing the question of whether the attacks by the IDF and under the direction of Mr. Netanyahu in Gaza, which have killed twice as many people as were killed in the Blitz, um, amount to genocide. And
Mm.
there's a legal argument on that subject. They clearly amount to mass killings. So that's heartening. Um,
Even as the
and
US
so,
preparing to, I mean, the US attacks on the International Criminal Court are
well,
ongoing.
they're brutal and they're disgraceful. Marco Rubio made another one last week, and they're so stupid because, of course, the International Criminal Court is there to punish war criminals, and America is not part of it. Well, it's all right if America is not part of it, but America is actually attacking it and trying to destroy it. And that is insufferable. And it's perhaps the worst side effect of the Trump administration is that 8 ICC judges are banned from attending the United Nations in America. I think the United Nations should move from America because it's too vulnerable in New York. Its people can be and are in the ICC case prevented from attending America. It should go back to Paris where it began back in the 1940s, and I think that would be one in the eye for the Trump administration, and it would prove to the world that some of its attitudes, which are all go back to Jesse Helms and the American Republicans of the 1970s, who believed that the UN was a plot against America. That's something that should be considered, but at the moment, the attacks by America on the organization set up to promote international justice are scandalous and despicable.
Another question that just came in was a question about the definitions of a war crime, and would it make any difference if there was a new definition of a war crime? Question mark. Or is it uh, or is it all so exhausted and impoverished that there is no reason to invest even more in getting more scrupulous detail around the definition? Because as you detail in the book, there will be no action because, in a sense, everyone's implicated. Starting with the bombing of, the Blitz and the bombing of Dresden, everyone's implicated in the crime.
Well, everyone is not implicated in the crime because the crime hinges and focuses on those who give the orders. In Russia, that predominantly means Putin and his generals, some of whom have been indicted by the ICC. There has to be mens rea, as lawyers call it. There has to be an intention to kill civilians, and that was certainly the intention of the commanders who ordered the killing of civilians, the bombing of residential homes and buildings. It can clearly be traced to them. So the actual criminals, those we say most responsible, that was the formulation we used in the war crimes courts set up by this United Nations. Those most responsible are those who gave the orders. It's called command responsibility. And those commanders are those who are brought to the dock.
Can I ask? I do have a question here on the authoritarian nations, which I'll get to. But before I do, recently we had a couple of Australian submariners practicing because of this AUKUS deal we're doing with both the UK and the US. There's a lot of training going on, and we had some of our submariners were on board a US submarine that torpedoed and sunk an Iranian ship in international waters that was doing nothing to no one, completely harmless. And a couple of people in Australia said, we said of the Australian submariners, whatever the Americans think of that, for us, that's a war crime, and those submariners are implicated in that. To which the Prime Minister reassured the entire nation that it was okay because those submariners had been sent to their room while the torpedoing was underway. Are we now in crazy town with that kind of absurdity? And, if there were no survivors, I don't think, of that attack. But if there were and they wanted to take an action against Australia and the US, would they be able to?
Well, it's of course, if there were evidence that the Australians participated, fired the guns, I wouldn't have thought there was any case against Australians who merely were present. maybe they would be required to give evidence as witnesses were there any prosecution. But
Right.
there wouldn't be because America does not acknowledge crimes committed by its own people. Um, I mean, when I was young, the Vietnam generation, we had My Lai and
Mm.
Lieutenant Calley, who was at least prosecuted for killing villagers in the village of My Lai and sentenced to prison, but President Nixon interfered and ensured that he was moved to a comfortable prison with a live-in lover on a military base. It's gotten worse, I'm afraid, because there was a guy called Clint Lawrence, who was a commander in Afghanistan and who ordered his troops to kill a passing couple on a motorbike. And good thing, his troops actually, his men gave evidence against him in
Wow.
his own trial, and he
Wow.
got 20 years in prison. And after a few years, he was discovered by a Murdoch employee called Pete Hegseth, who was working at the time on Fox News, and he ran a campaign and persuaded President Trump in his first lot of pardons in his end of his first term to state that Clint Lawrence was not a war criminal, he was a war hero, and so he was pardoned. So he is the equivalent of the old Lieutenant Calley, no war crime for killing civilians. And this is the worry, I think, of Australia participating with its main ally in war. I mean, we have done that loyally, as almost by knee jerk in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But can we do it? Can we participate with a country um, often giving the orders?
Mm.
I mean, I
It's
think
not,
of my
yeah,
father was a fighter pilot in the South Pacific in the Australian Air Force, but he was often fighting and flying under the command of Americans. And of course, it wasn't objectionable, but flying and fighting and submarining under the command of Americans who do not recognize war crimes is something that we need to think very carefully about. I mean, in one level, yes, we're uh, prosecuting Ben Robert Smith for a classic war crime of killing prisoners, basically.
mm,
Um, I don't know the details of that case and won't comment on it, other than to say that Australia has staked its claim as one country that does recognize war crimes and is prepared in at least one case to take action. But it's not. Uh, it's not present to America, which begins the Iran war by wiping out the head of state and 50 others, and then immediately bombs a school that kills 168 schoolgirls
yeah,
and denies against all the obvious evidence
yeah.
that it's done so. So that's the world we live in, and that's the ally that we're most associated with, particularly through AUKUS.
And these are really critical, these are such critical questions that Australia is needs to struggle with. We haven't struggled with it very much at all until very recently, but AUKUS will tie us hand and foot to the US, and it's pretty clear the US is going to be in charge. It's pretty clear they will do what they want to do when they want to do it with the submarines. And I, knowing that, knowing that Australia is putting itself in a much closer relationship with a country who has already told us does not recognise war crimes and rejects the international agreements that we abide by. I'm wondering if there isn't a legal, if that doesn't carry a legal charge for Australia to knowingly become closely tied with that kind of outlier, legal outlier.
Well, it's obviously a problem for Australian forces who are subject to the International Criminal Court, which we believe in and signed up to, if undertaking orders from America, whose commanders are not subject to that law. So that does require some thinking.
Yep. I'll also just, we're getting almost out of time, but I couldn't let this go with a number of people raising the prospect of, most people are very excited about this idea of a democratic coalition. But a number of people have raised the point that, for instance, China wouldn't be able to join such a democratic coalition, despite the fact that when it comes to wars, it is the democracies that have prosecuted most of them recently. And I'm wondering if you want to comment on that, or whether or not the idea of a democracy doesn't limit the inclusion of states that would otherwise maintain a commitment to human rights acts or values.
Well, these things would have to be worked out, but I think those countries that declare themselves as democracies, and that entails abiding by human rights principles and not shooting protesters or locking them up or abolishing the freedom of the press, blah, blah, blah. I can give
Mm.
you
Yeah.
the basics of democracy, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, and so forth. We
Mm.
can list those principles that would be erected, and that any country that was adjudged by a court to have disrespected them would be kicked out. So that's
That's
how you
that.
deal with that. Yes.
Geoffrey,
It
we
all
have
sounds
run out
so
of.
simple
No, it
in
doesn't. It
theory,
really doesn't
but
sound simple, but
it's
it does
important, I
sound
think.
like the right-sized ambition for the moment that we're in. It really, like, the stakes are enormously high globally right now for all of us. So does sound like an incredibly ambitious, exciting, light on the hill, really, a hopeful thing. So I'm sure if you ever want to come to Australia and help us get organised, we'd really welcome that. Geoffrey, thank you so much for your book, for the extraordinary work that you continue to do, and for tonight. It's been really wonderful.